Hi, we're really happy to be here. It's really nice to share a space with Regina again, even if it's not the same physical space. So just really grateful for all the work that's gone into the organisation of this event and really enjoying the presentation so far. So Lauren and I are going to present on an article that we've just had accepted in the Journal of Genocide Studies and Prevention, but it's also the foundation of a book project. So we're definitely at the stage of welcoming all and any feedback. What we're going to do today is kind of split it between us. So Lauren's going to provide some context to our presentation by talking about the nexus between environmental harm and mass violence. And then I'll introduce the theoretical side of the conversation, so a bit about transitional justice. And then we're going to split the critiques that we're offering. So Lauren's going to talk about legalism and neo-colonialism, nice small topics for this morning. And then I will talk about the structural inequality critique and the liberal imprints of transitional justice. And we'll obviously explain all of that in more detail. And then we're going to just share some thoughts on the prospects of greening transitional justice. So I'll hand over to Lauren.
Okay, everyone. So yes, this slide, we're just going to give you some context about the relationship between environmental harm and conflict or mass violence. So we've identified a number of ways in which conflict and environmental harm intersect. So the first is environmental harm as a cause of mass violence. So while there may often be various social, cultural, economic, and political dynamics that factor in terms of what causes conflict, competition over natural resources can be a significant motivator of mass violence. So for instance, intercommunal competition over land has been linked to the genocidal violence in Rwanda and in Armenia, for instance. Misuse or degradation of the environment can negatively impact upon communities. It can put pressure on societies, entrench societal division, and increase the potential for violent conflict to break out. And many conflicts have their roots in issues of resource competition or resource scarcity, for instance. So one example of this is that unsustainable natural resource exploitation has been said to be a factor in causing mass violence in the Solomon Islands and also in Liberia. Environmental harm can also be used as or environmental destruction, I should say, can also be used as a deliberate method of inflicting violence. So for instance, as many of you will be aware, and as depicted on the image, that's the background of this slide, the US's use of Agent Orange in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos was a way to deprive targeted populations of resources and shelter. Environmental destruction has also been specifically linked to genocide. It can be used as a tactic of genocide. So for instance, during the Guatemalan dictatorship, the army operated a scorched earth policy. So they burned cornfields that were deemed sacred by the Maya. So they destroyed a food source, and they also perpetrated a cultural violation. The third connection between mass violence and environmental harm is that even if environmental damage or destruction hasn't been used as a deliberate method of violence, mass violence can cause damage to the environment in various ways. So one of the examples would be the use of landmines. So for example, in both the Balkan states and in Cambodia, landmines have impacted upon soil quality, on plant and animal life, and also threatened biodiversity in those regions. Another example of this impact of conflict on the environment is from Rwanda. So in the aftermath of the genocide, displacement camps and resettlement areas, there were negative impacts on biodiversity there because you had large numbers of people living in these areas, and they were having to rely on and compete over the natural resources in those spaces, and that had a negative impact on the environment there. The final connection between environmental harm and mass violence that we've picked out is that environmental harm can be an impediment to building a long-term sustainable peace. So environmental degradation can hinder post-conflict recovery, and failing to address environmental inequalities can make a return to violence more likely. So for instance, in Darfur. It's been argued that long-term peace will be unlikely unless underlying environmental issues and livelihood inequalities are addressed. Before I move on to the next slide, I just also want to note that these connections between conflict, mass violence, and environmental harm are only exacerbated by the climate crisis. So, for instance, climate change can cause environmental degradation that in turn might ignite violence. And in the longer term, mass violence can deplete the resources that communities might have and might use to push back against the effects of climate change, which in turn renders them more vulnerable and more at risk of harm. Okay, Rachel, I will mute myself.
Thank you. So these interconnections that Lauren has been exploring have received increased international recognition. So we see this, for example, in the work of the International Committee for the Red Cross and the International Law Commission, who've been developing protective guidelines with regards to the environment during conflict. And then at the ICC, we see debates around how to respond to this kind of harm, both in the calls of a crime for ecocide, as we've seen, but also in the push to use the existing framework to prosecute atrocities that have these environmental implications. And then notably in Colombia, we've seen the recognition of the territories of Indigenous and Black communities specifically recognized as a victim of conflict. But what we haven't really seen is a systematic engagement with these links within transitional justice. So by transitional justice, we mean the practices and the mechanisms that arise in response to periods of conflict and political violence, and also the field of academic scholarship, which we belong to, which seeks to provide the legal, political, and philosophical concepts that underlie those practices. So, as flagged on this slide, the field has been criticized for its inability to cope or address environmental harm by Janine Natalia Clark in 2016, who said that environmental harm has been completely unexplored. That's not entirely fair as an accusation. There is an emerging literature that increasingly situates conflict and responses to conflict in their environmental contexts. And this kind of specific environmental literature can also be placed in the context of a broader critical transitional justice scholarship, which seeks to expose the limitations and blind spots of the field and highlight the kinds of harms and the kinds of victims that are often overlooked within the field. So although that kind of broader scholarship doesn't always explicitly engage with environmental harm, Lauren and I's research into this area has found that certain critiques are particularly salient to this conversation. And what we wanted to do in this presentation is draw out some of these threads from the critical transitional justice scholarship and bring it into conversation with literature that's been thinking about environmental harm for a long time, such as green criminology, Indigenous scholarship, and environmental justice scholarship. So we have 4 critiques. We're going to take them one at a time, obviously. And for the first, I'll hand back to Lauren.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So the first critique that we focused on is what's been described as the dominance of legalism within transitional justice. So in transitional justice terms, transitional justice in part emerged from a recognition that law isn't the only or indeed the best or the most effective or appropriate way to respond to past harm. So in transitional justice, for instance, we saw like the emergence of truth commissions, of a greater role for oral history, for example, various mechanisms of dealing with harm. So despite the fact that the field sort of emerged as a way of saying that law isn't the only solution in terms of addressing mass violence, legalistic approaches remain very central to the practice and scholarship of transitional justice. So we still have this strong sense that law and legal mechanisms are key to achieving justice for past harm. This legalistic tendency, however, does exclude certain forms of injustice or harm. So within transitional justice, there tends to be a focus on violations of civil and political rights. So for instance, ill treatment and torture, arbitrary detention, and of course, the right to life. Criminal acts, so harms to the person or the destruction of property, also remain a focus. So this focus on criminal law means that other forms of harm and some discriminatory practices tend to be excluded from the transitional justice gaze. They're not captured by transitional justice mechanisms. So a critical scholarship has emerged around transitional justice. So for instance, Eilish Rooney and Fionnuala Nealine have critiqued the dominant frameworks of transitional justice for the lives they ignore, the injustices they fail to see, and the patriarchal and racialized power structures that remain intact and unexamined. Yet within these emerging and in some cases now quite well developed critiques, environmental harm still remains relatively sidelined or overlooked. Another key factor in this area is that dominant legal frameworks are anthropocentric. So man is considered to be the central focus of the law in mainstream legal thinking. And as a result, environmental harms are often excluded. Oh, does someone have their mic on? I'm just getting a bit of feedback. Okay, I'll go ahead. So environmental harms are often excluded, or if they are addressed, they're dealt with from this anthropocentric perspective. So they're considered in terms of damage to property or damage to human health. So for instance, the Sierra Leonean Truth and Reconciliation Commission acknowledged the physical violence that resulted from resource extraction, but it overlooked the related environmental harm caused by that resource extraction. So what all of this means is that victims of environmental harms that are not recognized as crimes are overlooked in transitional justice, and the non-human is also overlooked. So for instance, non-human animals, ecosystems, and land. There are occasional exceptions to this. So Colombia's Special Jurisdiction of Peace has recognized the territories of the Awa and Nasa indigenous peoples as victims of the conflict. In the image on the right of this slide, this is the Eye That Cries in Peru. So this is a memorial to the memory of the victims of the internal conflict in Peru. And the sculpture that you can see at the center is Pachamama. This is an ancestral goddess, and Pachamama was chosen for inclusion in this sculpture to link the violence of the conflict to the pain inflicted on Mother Earth. So the next critique that Rachel and I identified is this neo-colonial tendency in transitional justice. So this is something that's been identified now by a number of scholars, and there's an emerging critique around it. So from this perspective, international standards of justice are given precedence over indigenous or traditional practices. And as a result, there is a dominance of global north in both scholarship and practice. At this point, I will acknowledge that Rachel and I are both global north scholars, so we're arguably part of this dominance, this imbalance. So our own positionality as sort of white Westerners engaging with the neo-colonial literature is something that we are reflecting on as we go through this. As Rachel mentioned, this presentation is based on an article, which is very much our sort of early exploration of this. So we're continuing to sort of read and educate ourselves around these ideas. One of the things I think that we probably need to think more about and be more explicit about is that Indigenous communities are not homogenous. There's differences between and within them. And as we develop this work, we'll read further and engage more with this. For current purposes, to come back to this dominance of the global north in transitional justice, what this means in practice is that transitional justice programs and mechanisms are often created or designed in the global north and are characterized by the dominant legal forms here, such as individual accountability and retribution. And Rosemary Nagy has explored that as a result of this, you get these like one-size-fits-all solutions imposed on a diversity of contexts that don't relate to the circumstances of the local context. In terms of the scholarship of transitional justice, Padraig McAuliffe has talked about, he describes that there's a notable lack of researchers from the global south in transitional justice theorization. So if we think about what the implications of this are for transitional justice, as indicated in this quote by Anne Naim on the right, even the possibility of an Indigenous alternative conception of justice is not taken seriously at a theoretical or empirical level. So the exclusion of perspectives outside of the global north from transitional justice silences alternative ways of knowing and different conceptualizations of justice. So in particular, excluding Indigenous perspectives can silence worldviews that are of real relevance to how we conceptualize and understand environmental harm. A key factor here is that for many Indigenous peoples, the relationship between humans and nature is one of interdependence rather than one of human dominance and exploitation. So there are some transitional justice approaches which engage with the particularities of the specific context and seek to incorporate Indigenous knowledge. So the practice of Garinka in Rwanda is one example of this. However, these instances remain relatively exceptional. For a long time, transitional justice researchers have recognized the need to localize transitional justice, so to make it more relevant for the specific context in which these mechanisms are being set up. But today, in practice, transitional justice still often fails to do this. So we're still in this sort of place where the complexities or nuances of particular contexts aren't fully taken into account and responded to. Okay.
Thank you. So our third critique is then about transitional justice's ability to deal with the kind of structural inequalities that we might associate with environmental harms. So as Lauren mentioned at the start of this talk, unequal access and distribution of natural resources are often root causes of conflict, but these transitional justice prioritizations of civil and political rights and certain forms of criminal perpetration can leave these underlying systems of, for example, land dispossession, discrimination, or oppression intact. So what that means is that a number of harms are left unaddressed. So for example, a transition from conflict to peace may simply return marginalized groups to positions of subjugation, restricting their ability to access, use, or care for their natural resources. It can also reduce the chances of sustainable peace and plant seeds for future violence, as Lauren also mentioned earlier. So there's two strands of critique that challenge this focus on specific types of harm. So one comes from the transformative justice scholarship. So that body of scholarship proposes that we move away from a focus on a short-term period of transition to a more long-term process of change. And then outside the context of mass violence, we can find very similar arguments in environmental justice literature. So both of these bodies of work are sharing a focus on interrogating and confronting structural contexts in which harm occurs and continues to occur. So in our research, we found that what often bridges these two bodies of scholarship is an interest in Nancy Fraser's work on trivalent justice frameworks. So this framework and the work of environmental activists in pursuing transformation gives us a bit of an insight into what an environmentally transformative response to a conflict might look like. So for example, Nancy Fraser highlights the value of redistribution. So redistributive justice might require economic change to the management of energy production or natural resources. And in cases involving Indigenous communities may involve the re-establishment of certain custodial land relationships. When we think about representation in this context, this would involve a genuine commitment to engaging with the role of identity in conflict and the simultaneous role of identity in shaping the control and use of natural resources again. So that sensitivity to an inequality would ensure that the kind of discriminatory practices that may have caused conflict and conflict-related environmental harm are not repeated within transitional justice mechanisms, and that we ensure that the voice and agency of those that are most targeted by environmental injustice are recognized and given voice. Recognition, in turn, might require a recognition both of the range of harms that can be experienced during conflict, including environmental harms, but it might also extend to the recognition of different types of relationship and claims to environments, the historic territorial sovereignty of targeted groups, or indeed going further, the rights of nature in its own right, rather than just as a resource used by human beings. So it might be that the pursuit of that kind of transformative justice could facilitate a move towards a more egalitarian principle with regards to nature. However, this is quite a bold claim, and when we think about this, we come up against the limits of what transitional justice can achieve, but also the broader context in which transitional justice and any response to conflict operates. So I'll explore that in our next slide, if you don't mind moving it on, Lauren. Thank you. Thank you. So The last critique then, just to end on a big one, is that transitional justice is embedded in particular processes of political and economic liberalization that limit its ability to address environmental harm. So when we think about this, it's helpful to place transitional justice in the historical context from which it emerged. So this is the 1970s, the rise of liberal democracy, and also the rise of neoliberal market values. And we can think about, at that time, the move towards a particular kind of liberal market democracy and the simultaneous decline of left-wing political movements, and then the emergence of this neoliberal economic theory. So transitional justice is inevitably shaped by the context in which it emerges and evolves. And it's been linked to endorsement of liberal peace building. These processes of liberalization, the prioritization of civil and political rights raises its head again, and then the individualization of victimhood through that rights-based framework. So in the vast majority of cases, we can see that there's a risk that environmental harm will increase in the aftermath of conflict through processes of privatization and deregulation. And it's not novel for us to say that our current political and economic systems have not done much to recognize or further economic, social, and ecological interdependence. So we can think about the work of sociologist David White in his recent book on ecocide, where he notices that it's not even controversial anymore to say that economic growth is impossible to decouple from environmental destruction. So what we're saying is not that transitional justice is in itself furthering these kinds of agendas, but we are saying that these links between transitional justice, political liberalization, and the dominance of neoliberal market values presents a challenge to transitional justice as a way of addressing environmental harm. And it's not about conflating transitional justice with long-term interventions or the processes that facilitate those processes of economic change. But we're saying that the field can reasonably be critiqued for overlooking the role that international market forces can play in causing and exacerbating conflict, for continuing to support reforms that foster capitalism as a dominant way of looking at the world, and for producing scholarship that fails to critique these assumptions. It's worth noting that some folks have gone a bit further in their critique of transitional justice. So we've flagged the work of Boucher there, who has noted that processes of transitional justice can actually be framed as prefiguring and supporting processes of neoliberalism. So we can see this play out through the focus on individual rights violations. So what that does is it excludes the possibility of redress for structural violence, as I mentioned, and it precludes a conversation about redistributive justice, both of which would not really be compatible with the neoliberal project. So these kinds of taken for granted assumptions mean that we can think of transitional justice as foreclosing other kinds of possible features, inhibiting the possibility of a green transition, which might instead look towards the growing range of economic models being put forth, which center democratic control, environmental protection, and the well-being over the inevitability of growth. So just to wrap up then.
Okay, so yeah, as we said previously, this is sort of early days for us in thinking about this. So we've been trying to think about what we can maybe do about all of this and how we can start to sort of green transitional justice. So one of the possibilities that we've explored here is the expansion of conceptualizations of legal personality and victimhood. So for instance, in Carsten Stan's work on colonialism and international law, he writes about how if we have overly narrow conceptions of legal personality, this can render certain victim identities invisible. The law just won't see them. So following from this, then we suggest that a more expansive conceptualization of legal personality might help to bring environmental harm to the fore in efforts to address legacies of past violence. So there have been some moves made in this direction within transitional justice. I already mentioned the example of Colombia and the recognition of Indigenous peoples as victims. In non-transitional justice contexts, we're seeing this as well. So for example, there are rivers in New Zealand and in India that have been given the legal status of persons. In terms of our understanding of victimhood, Rachel and I have been reading the work, as she mentioned, of green criminologists and green victimologists. And their work draws attention to the victims of harms that are not recognised as crimes. In addition, as well, if we think about the rights of nature, the rights of future generations, and the rights of Indigenous peoples, these are all frameworks which might facilitate a more comprehensive recognition of the full range of harm that conflict can cause, including environmental harm. And in turn, if we begin to recognise those types of harm more, then this means that acknowledgement of those harms and inclusion of those harms could be taken into account as transitional justice processes are designed. A key strand in our thinking around this and in our reading around this is the notion of transitional justice from below. So this draws on the work of Kieran McAvoy and Lorna McGregor. So they talk about transitional justice from below as being a way of thinking about transitional justice that critiques these like elite-led top-down mechanisms, and also is about exploring the work of those at the grassroots. So essentially, transitional justice from below is about including those most impacted by harm and those on the ground in transitional contexts in the work of transitional justice. So in terms of what this means for our thinking about how we might green transitional justice is that responses to mass violence need to engage with local understandings of and relationships to nature. And this engagement needs to go beyond a sort of tokenistic nod to local practices and be about more than listening to previously excluded voices. So we've been reading the work of Siam and others on decolonization and Indigenous futures to suggest that this needs to be about doing real work to build and maintain meaningful partnerships and alliances between transitional justice practitioners and those who are on the ground in sites of transition who are experiencing the effects of these environmental harms. And I'll hand over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, so just to build on that point then, in addition to foregrounding this from below perspective, I think what we are suggesting is that a more fundamental shift is needed in how we actually conceptualize and practice transitional justice responses to atrocity. So there's a growing scholarship, as we flagged, on this need to decolonize transitional justice and to call attention to alternative and particularly Indigenous visions, aspirations, and aims. So in recognizing these arguments, it's not about saying that Indigenous people owe it to us to solve the problems that they did not create, or that we should become extractive about Indigenous formulations of justice and apply them to, whatever particular context. But what it does mean is that there's an argument in favor of broader engagement with a more diverse conceptualization of the environment and other understandings of harm and healing from those that we see dominate the conversation at the moment. And what we're saying is that a recognition of the veracity and validity of those alternative ways of looking at the world might help us reimagine the relationship between humans, their places, their environments, and the harms that are caused by conflict. So as put on the slide there, what is needed is a decolonization of the legal and social knowledge that informs the field of transitional justice, but above all, the will to promote deep discussions about the pluriverse of worlds, an open mind and a receptive heart. So what these discussions might encourage is a shift away from a belief in an abstract universal and a questioning of some of the dominant global north perspectives that we hold on to. So to conclude then, we are making these critiques in the knowledge that there's a limit to what any transitional justice response can offer in the aftermath of atrocity, and particularly in response to diffuse, widespread, slow to reveal themselves environmental harm. But we're aware of the urgency of the situation, as has been explored at this conference. It's crucial that all ways of addressing harm are gearing their minds towards questions of environmental destruction. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, this has to be the top priority for everyone, everywhere. So what we've seen is that transitional justice has already evolved in lots of ways to better reflect and respond to harm, and in response to critiques that certain practices might be problematic or in need of repair. So what we're saying is with the growth of environmental pressures and the need to engage with these pressures, transitional justice may have a role to play in repairing environmental harm.